Good evening. I'm Ann Thornton, Vice Provost and University Librarian here at Columbia University, and I would like to welcome you all to tonight's event, the 7th Annual Norman E. Alexander Lecture in Jewish Studies. This event, on an annual basis, celebrates the Norman E. Alexander Foundation's generous endowments to establish the Norman E. Alexander Library of Jewish Studies and to establish a position for the first librarian for Jewish studies at Columbia University. A third Alexander endowment supports the library's rare book and manuscript holdings, including important Judaica resources and Hebrew manuscripts, one of the largest collections in the country, and over 200 of which we have completely digitized and made available online. Thanks to the generosity of the Norman E. Alexander Foundation, Columbia University has become internationally known for its Jewish studies collections. We participate in local and global partnerships, including a cooperative project with the National Library of Israel to make important early newspapers from the American Jewish press freely available online. Additionally, thanks to a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, we are creating online access to data gathered as part of the Language and Culture Archive of Ashkenazic Jewry project, carried out by scholars at Columbia between 1959 and 1972. This extraordinary resource will provide access to the spoken language of surviving post-World War II Yiddish speakers from over 600 locations in Europe, preserving an endangered linguistic and cultural legacy. We hope that the detailed interview material that's digitized in this project will ultimately be linked to the over 5,700 hours of audio tape field interviews with Yiddish-speaking informants from the same collection. Under the expert curation of Michelle Chesner, the library continues to add to its rare and unique holdings. One of our newest acquisitions is a Pincus book from 1772 to 1818 for the city of Pitigliano in Tuscany, which has a long history of Jewish inhabitants. In addition to celebrating the Norman E. Alexander Foundation's great gift to Columbia's libraries, this annual lecture also signifies the library's enduring commitment to supporting the field of Jewish studies at Columbia University. I want to thank especially Norman Alexander's daughter, Gail Benderman, who is with us tonight, for her enthusiasm and support of the collections and its related programs. And now I would like to present the Norman E. Alexander Librarian for Jewish Studies, Michelle Chesner, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening. Alexander Gorlin, fellow of the of the I'm going to get this wrong. Of the American Institute for Architecture, is a noted architect, urban planner, design critic, and author. He is principal of Alexander Gorlin Architects, founded in 1987, and specializes in a wide range of design programs that span the economic and cultural spectrum, including religious institutions, schools, high-end residential, affordable, and supportive housing for the homeless. Alexander Gorlin holds architecture degrees from Cooper Union and the Yale School of Architecture, and was a Rome Prize Fellow at the American Academy in Rome. He's the author of 5 books, including 2 on contemporary American townhouses, and most recently on Kabbalah in Art and Architecture, which won the National Jewish Book Award in 2013, and is the topic of tonight's talk. Mr. Gorlin.
Thank you very much, and I'm very honored to give the Norman Alexander talk this year, and especially grateful for his generosity and that his daughter is here. I'm very proud to be giving this talk. So, until recently, Kabbalah was limited in study to righteous men over the age of 40. However, this group, as you know, has been dwindling rapidly. And so in the news, Madonna and a number of her celebrity adherents have embraced a form of Kabbalah that has raised the awareness of this mystical aspect of Judaism. And at least that allows for other people to then study in different levels of depth. But at least she has raised the awareness of this. Another is David Bowie, who's actually shown here a drawing, the tree of the Sephirot, which very few people know that he was also very involved with the Kabbalah. My own interest came not from Madonna or David Bowie, but from, as an architect, I was asked to design a synagogue in Kings Point, Long Island. And I had never done one before. I had done residential work, housing, but at least I knew that I did not want to do a burning bush motif, which was commonplace in the 50s and 60s. And so I was looking for other areas of inspiration, and I happened to open up the works of Gershom Scholem, who has popularized a more academic study of Kabbalah in his book Jewish Mysticism from 1941. And so, to my great surprise, I found a number of ideas in Kabbalah that relate directly to art and architecture, to light, to space, to geometry as well. And so specifically, this was in Kings Point, which was originally the East Egg of the Great Gatsby, a former anti-Semitic community. However, Jews are now welcome, except for Orthodox Jews, and so the surrounding community did not want to allow a yeshiva to take over a public school. And this court case went to the Supreme Court, and it was allowed to expand various parts of it, including the sanctuary that I was asked to design, but it was highly limited and compressed in height to actually the level of the street and below. So my idea was, how do you bring light into this underground space? And I was specifically inspired by, which I'll talk about in more detail later, the themes of Isaac Luria, the idea of the tzimtzum, or the contraction at the beginning of creation, that leads to the vessels of light that then shatter. And this idea of a shattered vessel of light became the idea of a shape, a space that was broken open by light and created by that energy. And the ark itself I placed in the corner, but as a kind of glowing, luminous cube of light with two inverted triangles that only from the point of the beam up coalesce into the Magen David, the Star of David. And then at the same time, I used the tree of the Sephirot as the design for the ark, for the curtain of the ark. So all of these themes then alerted me to ideas of the Kabbalah, which I then studied in more depth. And to my surprise, also, I found that there were many artists who had been using themes of the Kabbalah for many years, including Anselm Kiefer, who is a German artist who perhaps in the guilt after post-war Germany has used themes of Jewish thought in his work in a critical manner. This is from the exhibition in 2010 at the Gagosian Gallery called the Shekhinah, or the feminine aspect of God, where he uses the bride's dress with the shards from the fractured vessels of creation, out of which grow the diagram of the Sephirot, which I'll show in a few minutes. So what is the Kabbalah? This is an engraving by the British artist Blake that shows the Ancient of Days, but it also implies the idea of creation, of God emerging from the void, creating light, and using God as the architect of the universe, always one of my heroes as an architect. course, today he would use a computer, but at that time he used a triangle to create the geometric forms of the creation. He also actually has all the circle, the square, the right angle of his beard and arm, and the triangle. But the themes that are illustrated in a way, first, of course, the Kabbalah means that is that which is received in Hebrew. And it's also the name above the reception desk, Kabbalah, in Israel. So it's actually a very common word. It's also a receipt that one gets in a taxi cab. So it's not always a mystical ride, but it's definitely the same word that's imbued with different meanings over time. So the mystical system is a theosophy, that is, it deals with the inner workings of God and how does his energy become manifest in the world. It's also a path for the initiates to actually directly experience God through a series of very difficult mystical exercises. It's also a theory of interconnectedness, where God and humanity are connected in unexpected ways, so that human action actually has an effect on God, which later I'll show is the idea of Tikkun, that the repair, which is a obligation of mankind to repair the shattered world of the universe. So that God actually needs man to complete the universe. And also the Torah is the word of God, and therefore every paragraph, every sentence, every letter is sacred and embodies like DNA the secrets of the universe. And that the universe was created in Hebrew, not in translation, and so the Hebrew language actually has magical powers to each letter that are also symbolic and related to gematria, or the assignation of numbers to each letter, where the concept of, let's say, for example, Chai, which is 18, comes from. And then finally, the idea of the whole universe is also a code for the name of God, which comes in various combinations from the 4-letter tetragrammaton, the Yud He Vav He, the 12-letter, the 42-letter, and even the 72-letter grand name of God, all unpronounceable. Of course, the 72-letter name makes a very good password for your computer, if you can remember it. So also in the Kabbalah, there are 4 worlds of 4 layers of reality in the world. The world of action, of materiality in which we live, the world of angels, the world of formation of the throne chariot of God, and the world of emanation of the internal workings of God and how the energy is brought to the world. As well, there are 4 levels of meaning to each of these 4 layers. Peshat, which is the literal, that is, the world is 5,700 years or so years old. Remez, the metaphorical and gematria. Drash is the detailed interpretation. And Sod is the secret ultimate meaning. Altogether, this acronym spells Remez, Peshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod spell Pardes, which is the orchard, or the garden, which the Kabbalah is likened to. So the entering of the orchard is considered how one enters into the mystical system. And there's a story where 4 rabbis, there's always 4, enter the orchard, and only one leaves safe. One dies, one becomes a heretic, one becomes mad, and only Rabbi Akiva leaves the orchard safely. So the idea of psychic as well as physical danger has always been associated with the study of the Kabbalah. And there are 2 passages in the Bible that are considered pre-Kabbalistic that are forbidden. One was the study of the beginning of Bereshit, of the story of creation, and the other is the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, the first paragraph of the throne chariot of God, in which Ezekiel sees this vision when he's exiled from Israel, where he sees the four creatures, the eagle, the ox, the angel, and the eagle, and the lion, holding aloft the throne chariot of God. Each of them has wheels within wheels with eyes on the rim, and each of the four creatures has four faces. So this mystical vision, whose meaning was never clear, became the inspiration for a whole series of hechalot, or ascension to the palaces of God, and how one ascends to have contact directly with the deity. And this is a Blake. It is also related, that ascension to heaven, of Jacob's dream of the angels that are ascending and descending the ladder. This is Blake's illustration of that, of the angels, the dream of Jacob. And this is a modern interpretation of that theme. This is Kusama, the Japanese artist, called "Tender is the Ladder to Heaven." So the idea is that many of these artists, some are explicit in their reference to Kabbalah, and others illustrate the idea. This is Tsai Guo-chung, also Chinese. He's Chinese, and this is a sky ladder to heaven, in which held aloft by a balloon is this ladder that then ignites, so it becomes this fiery ladder directly to heaven. So now the main themes, basically from the Lurianic school of thought, who was a rabbi from the mid-16th century, who reinterpreted or brought many of the ideas of medieval Kabbalah and his interpretation. So the first is the Tzimtzum, which is the idea of the void, or if God is everywhere, where is there space for creation? So he posited this idea of, rather than an active gesture, like in Bereshit, let there be light, he posited the idea of a contraction or a withdrawal. In fact, it's the idea of abstraction also, because in Latin, abstractus means to withdraw from. So perhaps that, as we'll see, is why this theme has inspired many abstract artists. So this space that God creates away from himself, he kind of exiles himself from this void space into which the first rays of light bounce around. This is the void theme from 1989 by Anish Kapoor, who's an Indian artist, who's actually his mother is Jewish. But he did a series of voids in which the idea of this absorptive black hole of space clearly illustrates the idea of the tzimtzum, or that void at the beginning of creation. And Barnett Newman, who was an artist from the 1950s, an abstract expressionist, he often used some Kabbalistic themes. I mean, he was eclectic. He also had Christian themes as well. But this is actually named the Zimzum, variation of the Tzimtzum, in which he has these folded plates of steel, of Corten steel, that create this space in between these walls to give the kind of equivalent of the idea of that contracted space in which light then emerges. And this is one of the leaps of of thought that I had, was finding actually architectural examples that mirrored certain ideas of painting, that all of which illustrated these Kabbalistic themes. This is the Salk Center in La Jolla, California, by Louis Kahn. Kahn was a great architect he also did the Yale Center for British Art, but his Salk Center has laboratories of folded concrete that look toward the Pacific Ocean and frame a view of the Pacific and of this space in between, creating this courtyard as a void that is sliced by a cube of travertine from which water emerges, like Moses striking the rock that then water issues from, and that slices the space in two and unites the earth, the Pacific Ocean, which is here. The sun sets directly on axis at the solstice, And so this, in a way, is the equivalent of the Tzimtzum that also Barnett Newman shows so clearly. And then at night, it even becomes more clear, like this slice, this sword of light, this chalice that points to heaven. And then this is Barnett Newman's One Mint from 1953, where he explored the same idea of this broad field of the blue void of the sky that spreads out, but then is sliced by the zip, as he called it, of light that again recalls the idea of the Tzimtzum and the emergence of light. In 1963, Newman, for the new architecture at the Jewish Museum, he showed new synagogue architecture. He did a proposal for a synagogue that was a cube that from the side was cut by this folded plane, which he actually calls the Tzimtzum here, this folded diagonal line. And again, as an eclectic artist, he was not, he did not want to be related completely with Jewish thought, so he called the inside also dugouts. He combined baseball and a synagogue. So the bima is the pitching mound over here, the mound, and these are dugouts where the people stand to watch the prayer service, where the pitcher, the individual, stands before God like the pitcher at a baseball game. But what's interesting is that he cuts open the sides with these folded planes that he calls the Tzimtzum. And that also relates in a way to Daniel Libeskind's Jewish Museum of Berlin, where he uses the diagonal folded line as a kind of dagger in the heart of the city to keep the memory of the Jews that perished during the Holocaust. And in fact, cutting that diagonal is the Holocaust room that goes right across the diagonal lines of the museum. And within, there's the Holocaust room, which is this grim space lit from above, claustrophobic, feeling like like one is in the grave, again trying to recreate the feeling of being a victim and keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive in the heart of Germany. Also, the idea of the void is in Peter Eisenman's Monument to the Murdered Jews of Europe, near the Brandenburg Gate, where he has 2,400 cubes, which he then actually realized later is the same number as the tractates of the Talmud. And it's cut by these paths, so it gives the impression of a cemetery. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen this, but you walk through this tilting plane in between these gravestones that are anonymous. There are no names on it, that give the feeling of unsettled memory of time that has and the Holocaust that has been commemorated. So within that void, within that Tzimtzum, light now emerges in points of light that bounce back and forth and eventually create the pattern of the Sephirot. There are 10 Sephirot, which is the tree-like diagram that shows how the energies of the divine light emerge and come down to earth. So they take the form in a diagram of the tree of life, and actually it's called. Usually, the way it's described is actually upside down. That the branches are above and the light comes down, but it's mostly drawn above like this. So Ein Sof, which is the infinite or the unchanging power of the divine, is above the Sephirot, and the light then draws down into Keter, which is the crown, and into a series of balanced, for example, Gevura or judgment is balanced by mercy. So left and right, they're balanced, and also up and down from the highest to the lowest, and the lowest is closest to the earth, to the people of Israel. This is the Shekhinah, or the feminine aspect of God. And so the idea of the feminine is introduced into God, so it is not he's not considered simply a male deity. Now, this form of the tree of the Sephirot is also shown as a concentric ring, where each of the letters is wrapped one within the other. Now, this is the plan of a Louis Kahn synagogue, Mikveh Israel, that was never built in Philadelphia, that clearly takes the plan of the 10 Sephirot. There are 10 light towers that are round. So the idea of the 10 luminous spheres of light that define the Sephirot, Kahn reinterprets as a plan of the synagogue itself. And the ark is over here, and you're surrounded by these towers of light that from the outside are a fortress, but internally are these very light-filled, mysterious shapes that define the interior space. And these are all drawings of the... Unfortunately, it wasn't built because, of course, it was phenomenally expensive. So mysticism has a price to it. This is another diagram of the Sephirot as a series of concentric rings, 10 rings, from the Ein Sof to the exterior. And this is by Ken Noland, also an abstract expressionist from the 50s, which also has 10 rings surrounding the center circle. And it's called Beginnings, and it's about the pulsing idea of the beginnings of light and energy. This is another diagram of the Sephirot, this is from actually 1513. So these abstract diagrams were really illustrated from the earliest times. They were completely abstract in the manner in which they diagrammed energy flow, interconnectedness, the relationship of man to God, and they're also the basis of the idea of the Madonna Kabbalah, which is really basically light and love, and so how to bring the light down into our environment. But they really keep it much more surface like that. This is the Antomium from the 1958 Brussels World's Fair that recalls that shape of the interconnected spheres of light. It was actually an enlarged carbon atom, but it was the idea of the peaceful use of atomic energy, but clearly the idea of the interconnectedness of energy throughout the universe. Now, the vessels of light are an interpretation of each of the Sephirot that emerge within the Tzimtzum. And this is the one that clearly has most implications for architecture, because architecture is very much about how light shapes space and form. And all great architects have talked about that, but the Kabbalah makes specific reference to these concepts that then architects reciprocally can use in their work. This is from the Sarajevo Haggadah, showing the creation of light and the first few days of creation. So within this dome, the separation of light from dark, the waters above from the waters below, the creation of vegetation. But again, even though this is from the 1300s, in a very abstract manner. Now this is James Turrell, who has used light as the theme of his sculpture, and this is one of the rooms that was at the Guggenheim Museum show a few years ago. He calls them the Ganzwelt rooms, where you actually enter and you're completely suffused by light without any sense of edges, so that you're, in a sense, become like a being of light within this space that Turrell creates. So it's the closest to the idea of like being within that vessel of light at the time of creation, when the light first emerges. And this was the Guggenheim itself, where he transformed the whole shape of Wright's interior, again emphasizing the idea of a vessel of light. Now, Wright himself actually did design a synagogue. This is from 1958. It's one of the last buildings he designed. It was in Elkins Park near Philadelphia. And the Rabbi Mortimer Cohn is one of the few clients that Wright acknowledged as an inspiration for his architecture. Usually he ignored what his clients said or wanted, but in this case, he actually deferred to the rabbi who told him he wanted a traveling Mount Sinai of glass. So he actually said explicitly he wanted a luminous glass structure, which Wright then interpreted in his own manner in a series of, in the hexagonal geometry that again relates to the Mogen David. Wright, in fact, worked in either circles, squares, or in hexagons. In this case, he used the geometry that was appropriate, that he would then design the synagogue from a geometry that was related to the Jewish religion. And this is actually Rabbi Cohn's hands with the plan of the synagogue superimposed over the over his hands, which Wright likened when you entered the synagogue to be in the hands of God. So he in fact tilted the planes of the interior so you would feel like you were nestled in the sacred space. And at night it truly glows like a vessel, like one of the vessels of light. It's mounted by 7 of these almost Art Deco-like structures to make it more horn-like, perhaps. And this is the interior, which is folded. It's 100 feet high. And oddly enough, Wright, for the ark, Wright wanted to use a burning bush motif. But the rabbi said, no, I don't want that. I want the phrase from the book of Isaiah where the seraphim, the angels, each of which have 6 wings, hold aloft the throne of God. So in fact, the rabbi very clearly told him he wanted a Kabbalistic theme of being within this luminous structure that would relate, in fact, then to the Merkavah, the chariot of God that described in Ezekiel, in which above was the color of ice, above which was the likeness of the throne. And then this is, the Ner Tamid is actually built into the abstract wings of the angel. So this, and then above is, which is Kadosh. Within that, from that chapter in Ezekiel, it says Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy is God. And then hovering above is this almost spaceship-like form, which is a microcosm of the geometry of the synagogue. And the rabbi said he actually referred to the Zohar, to the medieval book of the Kabbalah, and he mentions 5 colors that the original, the Ein Sof, or the light from above, is pure white, and as it comes into the reality of the world as we know it, it becomes different colors. So we can only understand the divine light through has its strains into the colors of the rainbow. And so this is the chandelier of light from below, looking up by Wright, with the 5 colors that the rabbi mentions from the Zohar. Now this is, then actually a lot of the research became very interesting because this is the great painter Rothko, who used light as a kind of live phenomena. And I discovered that actually if there are passages in the Zohar that exactly illustrate, for example, this painting. This is from the Zohar. The blue on the 2nd day was tinged with other colors, red and black. Blue, and red comes from it from the 2nd day itself, corresponding to the color of fire, and is Elohim. It inherits the color gold, for it is all one color. Blue emerges from that color red. When it descends, the red plunges deep into the place that is the sea and is dyed blue. So whether or not Rothko, who actually was friends with Barnett Newman and probably knew of Scholem's book from 1941 because it was available throughout the 50s, or not, he clearly was working with a parallel idea of colors emerging one from within the other, and illustrating this kind of divine sensibility. Or this is the by Sigmar Polka It's one of the stained glass from the Zurich Cathedral. Again, they're all sliced agate stones, lit from the light from behind, and recalling the idea of Ezekiel's the eyes and the eyes within the wheels, but it also illustrates this passage from the Zohar. The universe diffracts into 45 hues of colored light. 7 disperse into 7 abysses, each one striking its own abyss, stones gyrating. The light penetrates those stones, piercing them, and water issues from them, each one sinking into the abyss. So there are very strange parallels between the Zohar and contemporary artists, but I suppose that's the nature of mysticism. So one discovers these parallels. So after the tzimtzum, or the contraction into the void, then the emergence of light, first into vessels that then become the pattern of the Sephirot. These vessels now cannot contain the divine light because they're not strong enough to hold it. So at a certain point, this cosmic catastrophe occurs, the breaking of the vessels shatter, or at least the 7 lowest vessels shatter, which has been compared to their books called The Big Bang and the Kabbalah. It's very much like the beginning of the universe is the idea of the shattering of the vessels, the breaking of the vessels, and we live in the aftermath of that broken vessels. And these vessels actually still may contain sparks of the divine light. In fact, the Baal Shem Tov said there were 288 sparks, and it is each of our obligation to raise these sparks into Tikkun. But this is Kusama, and this is actually called the aftermath of the obliteration of the universe. We couldn't be more explicitly an illustration of the idea of the breaking of the vessels. It's a mirrored room in which these candles are then repeated endlessly. So you enter into this mystical realm of floating light that implies an original whole from which it broke. This is also by Anselm Kiefer, called the Shevarat HaKelim, or the breaking of the vessels. He uses that term explicitly, where you have these broken vessels lying at the bottom of this pit in this studio space that he created outside of Paris. Or this is Daniel Libeskind's diagram for the Imperial War Museum in Manchester, where he also uses the idea of the globe that has been shattered and broken into shards, like as war does. And these shards, he then isolates 3 of them. He calls one the air, the earth, and the water shard, to create this museum to house exhibits on the history of war. But that is the nature of these broken vessels, of this shattered order that we have to repair. This is Cornelia Parker, a British artist who blew up this shed and then reassembled it with a light in the center, so it looks like the idea of a frozen state of deconstruction. Now finally, the theme of repair, or tikkun, where it is the idea of the obligation of each individual to help repair the universe. And it's taken on the idea of doing anything charitable, but the original meaning had to do with the observance of the 613 commandments, of observing rituals, so that, because one does not know when the final spark will be raised back and the universe will be brought back into its original sense of whole. So it creates a great burden on individuals. How does one illustrate this in architecture? This is the Neue Gallery in Berlin. This is by David Chipperfield. Took this museum that was destroyed during the Second World War, but rather than recreate it completely, so that it would look like no time had passed and that the memory would be erased, he combined elements of the old and the new. So this is the same view of the stair hall. Rather than recreate the statues and the elaborate wall surfaces, he left them, he stripped them as a kind of container within which is placed this new stair that is abstract and creates this dialogue between the old and the new to create kind of something that is in suspended animation that is usable as a museum, but is haunting in the sense of maintaining the memory, a repair, but something that one recalls what happened before. And again, in the exhibits, you see the walls, the original walls of the museum, in fact, before the plaster and the paintings were put on, with exhibits that are crisp and modern and glass and steel, as a kind of creating this dialogue. And then this very striking synagogue in Mainz, Germany, by Manuel Hertz, a German architect, was recreated on the site of the one that was destroyed during Kristallnacht in 1939, when many synagogues were burnt, and in a sense was the beginning of the Holocaust. So on that same site, the idea of Tikkun is explored through a synagogue that maintains the ruin but builds something new adjacent to it that takes on actually the silhouette of the Hebrew letters Kadosh, or holy. And Emanuel Hertz explains that that the history of Judaism, because Jews were expelled from place to place, they never really had time to develop their own architecture, so writing became the equivalent of their architectural constructions. So as we saw, the idea of the magic of the Hebrew letters, here he uses very explicitly the idea of the outline of the Kadosh for the section of the synagogue. And the entire interior is actually covered in letters that are inscribed on the walls, which is the equivalent of the Sefer Yetzirah, which is one of the pre-Kabbalistic books that talk about the universe was carved out by 32 paths of wisdom, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, which became the tools by which the universe was created, and the 10 Sephirot. So this, and in fact, light pours through the openings of the Kadosh to create the synagogue. So here the letters are the shape of the architecture. And inside, it's all of various angles, almost like the shards after the breaking of the vessels that are then reassembled in this illustration of Tikkun. Then finally, not essential, but one of the more colorful ideas of Kabbalah is the Golem, which is the idea of the artificial creation of life through the use of Hebrew letters and God's name. And so it actually comes from a commentary on the Sefer Yetzirah, which says that there was a recipe for creating the golem, that one would put various ingredients together and then write Hebrew letters on top of this and recite a mystical prayer, and then life would be created. So this predates the idea of Frankenstein. On the other hand, it looks forward to artificial intelligence. In fact, Ray Kurzweil, who is the head of Google AI, had a dialogue with Rabbi Steinsaltz, who is one of the great contemporary Kabbalists, about this very subject. So Kabbalah, as esoteric as it seems, touches on many topics that have yet to even be explored. This is the Golem by Robert Wilson, which then cracks open, in which inside is someone dressed as a Hasidic person, and then this is by 3 artists who very clearly show the idea of the Hebrew alphabet. This spells emet, or truth. If you remove the aleph, which the emet creates the golem, when you remove the aleph, it becomes mate, or death, so he then stops. This is Adam. So the idea of the magic and power of the Hebrew letters. This is the golem from 1922 from the film that Hans Polzig, a great architect, actually did all the sets for. And then finally, one might ask, and I'll conclude, how can one create a golem of architecture? And so these are colorful, inventive shapes that John Haydock, who was the dean of Cooper Union, he designed these animated figures of architecture in 1995, each one with a interesting outfit, and they, like a circus troupe, would prance through the countryside. And it was only Frank Gehry who was able to create a real architectural golem in, of all places, Prague, which was the home of the famous golem of Rabbi Loew. And this was this building actually is called Fred and Ginger, where you have Fred as the upright element and Ginger, so the couple dancing, the idea of the implicit animated architecture alive, which with its own soul, again showing the concept of how Kabbalah can touch all aspects of our lives. So thank you very much. Any questions or? Yes.
Great. Who else said?
Oh. Well, it's unusual, I must say. Yes.
Did Frank Goldberg ever design anything else on the Kabbalistic theme?
Well, yeah, Frank Goldberg was his original name, yes, from Canada, and he changed it to Gehry, which he thought was less Jewish, but did he do any other? Well, I think for example, I think the plan of Bilbao is based on a rose, and the beginning of the Zohar talks about the rose within a rose within a rose, and the rose of Israel. So I do think there are themes. Actually, I go back. I asked him directly, because when I was doing research for this book, I knew him from Cooper Union, and I saw him at a lecture, and I said, "Have you ever studied the Zohar?" He said, "Well, I tried, but it was too difficult." He said, however, and he claimed that Teddy Kollek, who was the mayor of Israel in 1967, mayor of Jerusalem in 1967 after the 67 war, he had the great idea to reconstruct the third temple. And he asked Gehry to do that. And Gehry said, "Well, I don't really want to do the temple, but I'd like to do the base with the hotels and the restaurants and all that." So, so he did acknowledge that he's aware of that, and he's also friends with Margot Pritzker, who funded the translation of the Zohar into English by Daniel Matt, who is a great scholar from Berkeley, California. I haven't looked into the Kabbalistic implications of that.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. Sometimes when I'm looking at the Kabbalistic tree, it seems to me that the middle sphirot is Tiferet, or beauty. And I wondered if you as an artist, or if these other artists who work with Kabbalah took any particular inspiration from the fact that that idea of beauty could be central.
I think that's a very good point. That, yes, the central Sephirot in which they all coalesce, or the upper part intersect, is beauty. So I think in a way there was a implication from the beginning that beauty and art are at the heart of creation. So, which is why you have the Michelangelo illustrating the creation of mankind as the beginning of at the Sistine Chapel. So.
Thank you very much. I was recently in Barcelona at the La Sagrada Familia, and I noticed some things that struck me as Kabbalistic in nature, and some of those stuff with the lighting. I can't imagine it was intentional, but I wonder whether you are aware of any churches or other kinds of religious places of worship that utilize any of these aspects, because there is a rich history to Christian Hebraism and Christian uses of
that's right.
Kabbalah. I
haven't studied that in depth, but in contemporary architecture, for example, Tadao Ando did a Church of the Light in Japan, in which he literally cut out a cross through the concrete. And so in this case, the light is creating the form, which in a way illustrates that idea of the vessels of light. So I think it's, there are illustrative themes, but I'm not aware in earlier time, probably in the Renaissance there was, because there is a great theme of a history of Christian Kabbalah as well, which I didn't touch on here.
At the risk of asking you to repeat yourself, I had a similar question. Some of the artistic examples you showed certainly predated the 20th century, but almost all of I think all of the architectural examples were not just 20th century, but post-Holocaust. And you earlier in your talk referenced the importance of the Holocaust to one of the artists. I'm wondering if there is some connection between the kind of willingness to sort of bring Kabbalah into a kind of design vocabulary and the Holocaust, or were you sort of deliberately focusing on 20th century examples, and there are architectural examples that run deeper into the past?
No, I think it is a post-Holocaust thing, insofar as it was really Scholem's book on Jewish mysticism that brought to an English-speaking audience many of these themes that previously were not accessible. I mean, there were books that were translated into English in the 19th century, but they were often mixed up in Theosophy and the Order of the Golden Dawn and Madame Blavatsky, and it was a much more it was a different tradition that was apart from I don't want to say mainstream Judaism, but something that was dissociated from this kind of, as Yeats said, mystic mumbo jumbo in a way. So I think that, and I think the painters who studied this really were the ones who then brought it to the fore, like Newman. So I think that was what kind of sparked the interest in these Kabbalistic themes in contemporary, since the 50s, I would say. And it's really growing. It's interesting is because it's really a contemporary phenomenon. It's not something that was apparent earlier, I would say. The Daniel Matt's translation has just been completed this year, really. And I think it's one of the most poetic translations of the Zohar, actually, that's available. And also, just by talking about it, then people are, for example, I asked Stephen Hole, a Columbia architect, if he was, I said, he did this church, actually it's a Catholic chapel in Seattle, and it's literally, he described it as vessels of light, a series of vessels of light. And I asked him, because I also know him a little bit, I said, did you study any of Gershom Scholem? He said, absolutely. So he claimed, I think it's part of a kind of general education at this point, that people are now aware of these themes, and it becomes, at Stephen's level, let's say, something that he's interested in anyway, and it's a reconfirmation of some of these ideas. Yeah.
The masculine and feminine thing, I still think in the 70s, every once in a while it comes back around. Maybe it's people are more willing to speak or do hard on it. Chat about a little bit about that.
No, I think that the gender dualism is definitely something that people are now looking into the Kabbalah in more detail. And the Zohar is filled with all sorts of sexual passages about the union of God and mankind and the Shekhinah, and so it's very much involved with gender and different levels of connection, both sexual and spiritual. Oh, I don't know who that was, but You have to tell me. Okay.
All right, thank you.
Oh, one more question.
So yes, I just find it amazing how some of these structures that are more contemporary and modern, like have that sleek ambiance, but compared to the cathedrals and some of the museums that truly have like a deeper sense of history, they seem more infinite and they seem like they would last many ages compared to structures like this, even though, as you had said, this one resided from like history of like the golems and things like that. But like a learner like me, or as anyone else in this room, how could you say I could find some kind of enticing reason to look deeper into contemporary, more modern like structures, because they do have that historic sense, but like not as it draws compared to like cathedrals and churches.
Well, I would say the best of contemporary architects also create work that reverberates throughout history, that it recalls various historical examples but reinterpreted in a way. I mean, it's hard to compete with Chartres Cathedral, but I mean, it's I think in a different way. It's like looking at contemporary art, and or like looking at Barnett Newman. It's abstract, it's very simple, or Mondrian, but it has its own distinct sensibility that the greatest of which I think holds up to anything of the past, but in a totally different way. So.
Last chance. All right, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Really beautiful.